So I'm a plant taxonomist, and whenever I see a plant, I want to know what it is. But not every plant is planted in rows with a label there telling you just what it is. Certainly would make things a lot easier. But in nature, not everything is easy.
So how to identify plants? Boy, that's a tough one, I never thought, probably when I was in your place, that I would ever be able to do that. Sometimes, not with everything, but I would see this big challenge that I really didn't think I could overcome. And that just kind of goaded me on to say, I'm going to do that. And so now I'm a plant taxonomist, so you're in good hands. The bad news is, it's a lot of hard work. I've identified hundreds of plants just from scratch. You look up in this big book and you look through the descriptions and you read each one and you look at the plant. And the first 100, I gotta tell you, that was brutal. And it really helped when I had somebody that I could go to ask questions about it. And so, you got me, and I'm a plant taxonomist. I don't know every plant out there in Washington or in your yard, but I can do a pretty good job. So let's have some back and forth. I think that's probably the best way of figuring that out. There's a certain number of plants that I'll ask you to know, and so that really kind of narrows your world. I was looking at all the plants that could possibly exist in Arizona when I was doing my graduate school work. So, it was a pretty daunting task there. So it gets better with practice, and we need to start somewhere. And where we logically start is, how do you get to know a plant? It's kind of like getting to know a person, but it's obviously not a person, and it's a plant. It has different parts than people do. We recognize people by their eyes and their nose and their mouth and their eyebrows and hair and how they dress and how they walk. And as you get to know plants and animals too, then it is kind of the same in a way, but with plants. So you kind of get to know them as these different beings, and it gets a little easier. So let's start there, trying to get to know the parts of a plant. So there are plenty of terms that are applied to plants, and we need to differentiate them to a certain extent. So if you saw a plant that looks like this, then it'd be safe to call that a tree. And if you saw something like this, then you'd call it a shrub. A little bit of overlap between these two, but they're fairly clear. And then this we call an herb. These two have woody stems, and these do not. So we could really make maybe a Venn diagram to help us differentiate some of these guys. And so let's draw for the tree. Okay, that we have lots of different plants that would fall in this category, and lots that would fall in this category, and there's probably some overlap there. There's some difficult calls between trees and shrubs. Herbs are a little more clear. They don't have wood. They take on a lot of different forms. Okay, so there we have those different categories, and that describes the general appearance of the plant. The next one that I think I'd like to tackle is annual and perennial. And so obviously trees and shrubs, if they've made wood, they're not doing that just to live for the year. And there's plenty of herbs that are perennial as well, usually underground, but not always. And so here we have those that are perennial, that live for 3 years or more, and then those that are annual, those that live for a year. Now, and if that's the case, then they're definitely an herb. There's a few interesting side notes and, well, not side notes. There's a few other categories that instead of an annual, we could have a biennial, where they only live 2 years, we wouldn't call that a perennial, just a biennial. And then some that live even more briefly, an ephemeral, where they might live a month. That's their entire life cycle, and then they produce seed, and that's it. So all these guys down here are herbs, and then everything above that is a perennial. So we have that. Usually if we're talking about perennials, we're going to be talking about herbs, because if we say shrub, we know it's a perennial. Okay, so there's some of the terminology. There's another one that gets thrown out there, and that is evergreen. We even live in the evergreen state. Well, what is an evergreen? Is it a tree? Is it a shrub? Is it an herb? Well, the answer is yes. Yes, it is. So evergreens could be all of these. That's kind of another layer on top of all those. Just means they're green year-round. Okay, so what next? We can have an evergreen herb, we can have an evergreen shrub, evergreen tree. Most things are evergreen if they live in the tropics, but here in Washington State, definitely not tropical. We have pretty tough winters anywhere in the state, and so if it keeps its leaves all year round, it's an evergreen. Does that mean conifer? Well, in common terms, it kind of does. But let me throw now on top of all this some taxonomic categories. And so remember, taxonomy deals with how do we categorize all these different species. So let me actually start back down here. So one of our major groups is the mosses. And those are always herbaceous, pretty typically perennial as far as I know. And so that's one group that we could put in there. Ferns and fern-like plants we could put down here in the perennial herb category as well. They don't produce wood, so they're not shrubs, they're not trees. There are tree ferns, I know that, but it's not true wood like trees or shrubs would produce. So that leaves us with two groups left, and one of those is the gymnosperms. So that means naked seeds. And for a lot of people, that also basically means a conifer. That's one of the groups in gymnosperms, but there's also a couple of other ones. And so there are also cycads. If you've heard of a sago palm, then you know what a cycad is. There's one rather unique group, which is a ginkgo. We have the ginkgo petrified forest, and that's a conifer. It's not evergreen. I'm sorry, it's not a conifer. It is a gymnosperm. It's not evergreen, but is a gymnosperm, so it's deciduous out here, so it's not an evergreen. We also even have a few conifers, actually one that I know of, the larch, that is a deciduous conifer as well. So gymnosperms, most of them are trees, and most of them are evergreen. There are some shrubs in that category as well. So there are gymnosperms. There's also another weird group called the Netophyta or Netophytes, and they're a tropical plant that I'm not going to deal with here. They don't apply to us at all. Most gymnosperms are conifers that we know of in Washington State. We do have larches that are a unique deciduous gymnosperm and conifer. Most of the other ones are conifers. We don't have any cycads in the state, and we do have ginkgos, but they're planted here. They're an ornamental, and so really when we say evergreen, when we call it the evergreen state, we do mean conifers, because that's really the gymnosperm that we have here, and it stays green year round. But there are, I do want to note, plenty of herbs that are evergreen, that are not gymnosperms. And so what is everything else? We have four major groups of plants: the mosses, the ferns, the gymnosperms, and so everything else is an angiosperm. So sperm refers to seed, angio means container, whereas gymno means naked. These have naked seeds, and these have seeds in a container. And so these are the flowering plants, which are really the dominant plants today. And so if it's not in this moss circle or fern circle or gymnosperm circle, then it is an angiosperm. So really most of this other stuff that you see out here, grasses, phloxes, daffodils, balsam root, just about anything else you see is probably an angiosperm. Certainly the most abundant group out there today. And so that's them, and that's some terms that may be helpful in identifying plants. So depending on what kind of resource you use, be it the technical Flora of the Pacific Northwest, it's illustrated, which is nice, written by a couple of the greats, Hitchcock and Cronquist, even published right here in Seattle in the Washington State. You will probably need to have a lot of technical knowledge. You see it walks you through a very formal key with a lot of text, some pictures to help, which is nice. Not all of them have that, but this is probably beyond the capacity of most beginners. If you look at something more like a field guide, something a little less technical, this one has these kind of colored ribbons here, and it tells us that we start with either trees or shrubs, and then once we get into wildflowers, we do have this sort of search pattern. We can just kind of look around and see, well, what matches? Let me go to that page. And then they start arranging by families, which is a very taxonomic thing to do. Plant taxonomists like to organize plants into families. Sunflower is a big one. Got the figwort family, etc. So maybe a challenging way to make your way through, and you got this whole red section is all different herbaceous flowering plants. It's not until you get back here that we hit grasses and sedges and ferns and mosses. So also a bit technical. If we narrowed it down to a field guide on wildflowers of the Pacific Northwest, well, this is nice because we know we're in the right area, and it's just wildflowers, so no trees, no shrubs. Again, they tell you, well, what color is the flower? If you have a yellow flower, here we go. And furthermore, you'll see that on the outside here, it asks, what kind of flower is it? 5 irregular petals forming a tube. Well, that's pretty specific, so we need to know a little bit about flower morphology. These are composite flowers, and within the pink ones, we have 5 symmetrical petals, ovary superior. So this gets a little bit technical, but the more we know, the easier it is to identify something along that line. In our field guide that takes on a little bit of everything, then we're started off here in the conifer section and talks a little bit about them. It has a section for those that have just single needles and those that have needles in bunches. It moves on to trees and shrubs, talks about some of the plant flower parts, many stamens, versus those that are lower medium shrubs with 8 to 10 stamens. So some real general characteristics about it's a shrub, how big is it, and then it gets a little more technical there to help you narrow it down. We get into some monocots, some composites, dicots with 3, 6, or several petals. So there's a system to the way that this is arranged. It's not just an alphabetical list, and I would hope that you can identify a plant by doing something more than starting here on page 67 saying, nope, it's not that. Nope, it's not that. Nope, it's not that.
Nope, it's not that. Nope, it's not that. You know, if it's here on page 74, that's not too bad, but if you're all the way back here on page 279, that is going to take you a while. So we need to figure out sort of a system for identifying a plant. Another option that we have recently is to go online, and the Burke Museum, for example, has a random access key, and that allows you to put in, just by clicking with the mouse, the features that you know about a plant. And so I'd encourage you to try that one out. It doesn't have all the plants in there, but it asks you information that you might know. When does it flower? Where are you in the state? Is it a tree or a shrub? What color are the flowers? You may not know all that information, but it will take what you give it and start narrowing down that list. So the more you know, you might get a list back of, here's 15 different plants it could be. That's not too bad just to flip through. If you just say, I know it's a tree, it's going to hand you a list of 200 plants to look at. That's a little tougher. So give that one a try as well. Good way to identify plants. Then it gives you some pictures and references identified by professionals that you can look at and say, yep, that looks just like the one that I had. That must be my plant.